On the coast of southern Spain this week, the temperature in the middle of the night did not fall below 86 degrees Fahrenheit. That single number is what has European forecasters genuinely terrified, because a hot night that never cools is the exact condition that killed roughly 14,000 people in France back in 2003. Now, 2 heat domes have slammed into Europe in under 2 months, and the agencies are warning that this one could be worse than that catastrophe. But Europe is only where this shows up first. The machine driving it is already assembling over America, where 170 million people are about to feel the same force bearing down. So what is our summer about to become? If you want the real story behind our changing sky, the one the headlines keep missing, subscribe to the Sky Lab. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and just how hot it has gotten where you live. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The continent on red alert. Right now, as you watch this, more than 35 million people across France are living under the highest heat alert their government can legally issue. 35 departments are flashing red on the national map, the deepest colour Météo France has in its system, the colour it reserves for the kind of event that fills hospitals and morgues. Schools are closing by the hundreds. Cities have banned drinking alcohol in public squares, not as a moral measure, but because they have learned that dehydration in this kind of heat turns a festival into a mass casualty event. And the forecasters who issued those warnings are not using the careful, hedged language they normally reach for. One of them, speaking to reporters this week, described what is unfolding across Europe with 3 words: mind-bogglingly crazy. That is not a phrase meteorologists use lightly. These are people trained to strip emotion out of a forecast, to talk in probabilities and pressure gradients and confidence intervals. When they start sounding frightened, you should pay attention, because they are looking at something the rest of us cannot yet feel. What they are looking at is a wall of heat that has settled over the European continent and refuses to leave. France is forecast to reach 40 to 42 degrees Celsius this week, which is right around 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and Monday, the 22nd of June, may go down as one of the hottest single days ever recorded in the country, for any month of the year. Not the hottest June day, the hottest day, period. At least 4 locations in France have already broken their all-time monthly temperature records, and the heat has not even peaked. Across the border in Spain, the National Weather Service has declared the first official heat wave of the year, with temperatures climbing toward 44 and even 45 degrees Celsius, which is 113 degrees Fahrenheit, in the south of the country. And here is the number that should genuinely stop you. On the Almeria coast in southeastern Spain, the overnight low this week did not drop below 30 degrees Celsius. That is 86 degrees Fahrenheit, in the middle of the night, with the sun gone and no relief coming. Your body is built to cool itself when the sun goes down. The night is when the human system is supposed to dump the heat it absorbed during the day, when your core temperature is meant to fall, when you recover. Take that recovery window away, night after night, and the heat begins to stack inside people who have nowhere to escape it. Meteorologists have a name for a night that stays above a certain threshold. They call it a tropical night, and when you start seeing them line up back to back, you are watching the conditions that kill. The United Kingdom is bracing for its own record. The Met Office, Britain's national forecaster, has issued a rare red extreme heat warning for Wednesday and Thursday, and it is forecasting temperatures of at least 39 degrees Celsius, which is just over 102 degrees Fahrenheit. If that holds, it will not just break the British record for June, it will shatter it. The previous all-time June record in the United Kingdom was 35.6 degrees Celsius, about 96 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was set back in 1976, almost half a century ago. We are not talking about nudging past an old mark by 1/10 of a degree. We are talking about blowing through it by several degrees in a single afternoon. Italy has placed Rome, Florence, Bologna, and Turin under red alert, with nationwide heat warnings in effect. Germany has issued warnings across the entire country, and already there are deaths, not only from the heat itself but from people trying to escape it. 3 swimmers went missing in the Rhine. A young man drowned in a lake near Karlsruhe. In Austria, the town of Bad Deutsch-Altenburg hit 36 degrees Celsius on the 20th of June, the first time that reading had been touched in the country all year. And in France, alongside the direct heat deaths that have already begun to climb, a 17-year-old boy was swept away by the current of the Dordogne River, and 2 boys, 12 and 13 years old, died after jumping from rocks into the sea in northeastern Spain. People are not only dying from the heat, they are dying trying to get away from it. This is the second time in under 2 months that a major heat dome has parked itself over Europe. 2 of them, back to back, in a single early summer. And the forecasters are telling us, in plain language, that this one could be worse than the event they have spent the last 23 years using as the benchmark for catastrophe. Hold on that detail because it is easy to skip past and it matters enormously. This is the second major heat dome to hit Europe in under 2 months. The continent barely finished one extreme event before the next one built on top of it. That is not how heat used to behave. A severe heat dome was supposed to be a rare visitor, the kind of thing that arrived once in a summer if it arrived at all, with long stretches of ordinary weather in between. When you start seeing them stack up one after another, separated by only a few weeks, you're not looking at bad luck repeating itself. You're looking at a pattern that has changed its fundamental rhythm, an atmosphere that keeps falling back into the same stuck, heat-trapping configuration, because something is making that configuration easier to reach and harder to break. The frequency is itself a piece of evidence, maybe the most important piece, because random extremes do not cluster like this. The clustering is the tell. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because this channel does not trade in panic, and I am not going to stand here and tell you the sky's falling. Heat happens, summer is hot, records get broken and then forgotten. If that is the instinct rising in the back of your mind right now, the instinct that says this is just weather, hold on to it, because we're going to test it carefully with data before this is over. But here is what I need you to understand from the very start, and it is the thread that ties this entire story together. What is happening to Europe right now is not really a European story. It is a preview. Because the machine that is cooking the European continent, the specific atmospheric engine producing these records, is not bolted to the ground over Paris and Madrid. It is part of something that circles the entire Northern Hemisphere. It is the same machine that is, at this very moment, beginning to assemble itself over the United States. And Europe, as we're going to see, is simply the place on the planet where that machine shows its hand first. There is a reason forecasters in America are watching Europe this week with something close to dread. There is a reason a heat dome is already taking shape over the continental United States, one that forecasters expect to put roughly 170 million Americans under dangerous heat in the weeks ahead. And there is a reason the timing of all of this, with a brand new El Niño strengthening in the Pacific, has the people who study this for a living more uneasy than they have been in years. To understand why what is about to hit Europe genuinely terrifies the forecasters, and why it should matter to you no matter which side of the Atlantic you're sitting on, we have to do 3 things. We have to understand what is actually happening over Europe right now in full. We have to understand the machine producing it, because once you see the machine you cannot unsee it, and we have to follow that machine westward, across the ocean, to your doorstep. Because the question underneath all of this is not whether Europe is having a bad week. The question is what this bad week is telling us about the one that is coming for the rest of us. So let us start with the thing the forecasters keep comparing this to, the event so deadly it rewrote how an entire continent prepares for summer. Let us go back to the catastrophe of 2003 and find out exactly what it means when a National Weather Service says the heat coming this week might be worse. Part 2. Worse than 2003. In the summer of 2003, Europe learned what heat could do to a modern, wealthy, well-organized society that thought it was ready. It was not ready. By the time that summer ended, more than 70,000 people across the continent were dead. Let that number sit for a second, because it is almost too large to feel. 70,000 people. In France alone, the official excess death toll from the August 2003 heatwave was 14,802. These were not, for the most part, people caught hiking in the desert or working construction at noon. They were mostly the elderly, dying quietly in apartments and care homes, in a country with universal health care and a functioning government, during a stretch of days that the meteorologists of the time also struggled to describe. And the reason I am starting here, the reason the death toll of an event from more than 20 years ago matters so much, is that this week, the French National Weather Service said out loud that the heat now building could surpass 2003 in terms of maximum intensity. The people whose entire job is to forecast this, the people who lived through the worst heat disaster in modern European history, are looking at the next few days and telling the public it could be more intense than the event that killed 14,000 of their countrymen So we need to understand what actually happened in 2003, because buried inside that catastrophe are the rules of how heat kills, and those rules travel. They do not care what country you are in. The first rule is that heat is not a young, strong person's disaster. The research that came out of 2003 found that excess mortality became marked from the age of 35 and climbed steadily with every decade after that. The older you are, the more your body struggles to regulate its own temperature, the more likely you are to be on medications that interfere with cooling, and the less likely you are to recognize in the fog of heat stroke that you are in danger. By the time many of the victims understood they were in trouble, they could no longer help themselves. The second rule is stranger, and, in a way, more haunting. Researchers studying the 2003 deaths found that the single greatest predictor of whether someone died was not their age, and not even their underlying health, it was their isolation. The people most likely to die were the ones who were alone, the ones with no one checking on them, no one to notice that the apartment had become an oven, no one to bring water or open a window or call for help. Heat, it turns out, hunts the disconnected. It finds the person nobody is looking after. There was also a striking detail in the numbers. From the age of 45, the excess death rate was about 15% higher in women than in men of comparable age. Heat does not strike a population evenly. It reaches into the cracks of a society and pulls out the most vulnerable. The third rule is the one we touched on a moment ago, and it is the one that connects directly to what is happening on the Spanish coast right now. Heat does most of its killing at night. We tend to picture a heat death as someone collapsing under a blazing afternoon sun, and that happens. But the slow, mass casualty version of heat death is about the nights that never cool down. Your body can endure a brutally hot afternoon if it gets a cool night to recover. String together days where the afternoon hits 40 degrees and the night refuses to fall below 30, and the human body simply never gets to reset. The core temperature creeps up. The cardiovascular system, working overtime to pump blood to the skin to shed heat, begins to fail in people whose hearts were already weak. That is why those tropical nights in Almeria, those overnight lows stuck at 86 degrees Fahrenheit, are not a footnote. They are the mechanism. 2003 combined all of this with a drought that scorched crops across southern Europe, and it exposed something uncomfortable, that the wealth and infrastructure of a modern continent offered far less protection than anyone assumed. Most homes in France, in Italy, in much of Europe, did not have air conditioning, because for most of history they had never needed it. The buildings were designed for a climate that no longer existed, and so the heat walked in through the windows, and the death toll climbed for 16 straight days. After that summer, Europe changed. France built a national heat alert system, the very system that is flashing red across 35 departments this week. Cities created registries of vulnerable residents and plans to check on them. The colour-coded warnings, the public cooling centres, the bans on outdoor events, all of it was born out of the trauma of 2003. Europe armoured itself against the last war. It is worth understanding, in plain physical terms, exactly why heat does this to a human body, because the mechanism is the same whether you're in Paris in 2003 or in Phoenix today. Your body runs at a tightly controlled internal temperature, and it has essentially one powerful tool for shedding excess heat. It pushes blood toward the skin and it sweats, letting evaporation carry the heat away. But that system has hard limits. When the outside heat is relentless and the nights never cool, the heart has to work harder and harder to keep pumping blood to the skin, and for an older person, or someone with heart disease, or someone on common medications that interfere with sweating or fluid balance, that escalating strain is what fails. The cause of death on the certificate is often listed as cardiovascular or respiratory, which is part of why heat deaths get undercounted. The heat does not always kill directly. It overloads a body that was already running close to its limit, and the heart or the lungs give out under the load. The meteorology of 2003 is also worth knowing, because it is the same setup we have been describing. A powerful ridge of high pressure locked over Western Europe and simply would not move for weeks. As it sat there, it baked the soil dry, and once the ground lost its moisture, an even larger share of the sun's energy went straight into heating the air rather than evaporating water, which drove the temperatures higher still in a self-reinforcing loop. The death toll did not arrive all at once on the hottest afternoon. It built across the length of the event, lagging behind the temperature, climbing day after day as the cumulative strain wore people down, until the morgues in Paris overflowed and refrigerated facilities had to be pressed into service. It was the duration, the sheer relentlessness of a pattern that refused to break, that turned a hot spell into a continental catastrophe. And that is the single feature the forecasters are watching for again this week. Not just how high the peak climbs, but how long the machine holds the heat in place. And here is the deeply unsettling part. With all of that armour in place, with all of those lessons learned, the forecasters are still telling us this week's heat could exceed 2003 in raw intensity. The defences are better now. The warning systems work. People are being told clearly and early to take shelter. That will save lives. And it matters enormously. But the heat itself, the physical thing arriving over the continent, may be stronger than the event that killed 70,000 people in a Europe that had no idea what was coming. That should reframe how you hear the word record this week. When the United Kingdom obliterates a June mark that has stood since 1976, that is not a fun trivia fact for the evening news. It is a signal that the ceiling is rising. The thing that was once the worst case is becoming the baseline. Now, a careful person asks the obvious question at this point. Maybe 2003 was a freak. Maybe this is another freak. Maybe these are just rare, terrible rolls of the dice that happen to be landing close together by chance. It is a fair question, and it deserves a real answer, not a hand wave. Because if these events were random, there would be no reason to think Europe's bad week tells us anything at all about America's summer. But they are not random. There is a machine behind them, and once you understand how that machine works, you will understand why the same forces breaking records in Madrid this week are the ones quietly loading the dice over Texas and the Pacific Northwest. So let us open it up. Let us look at what a heat dome actually is and why this one will not move. Part 3. What a heat dome actually is. To understand why the heat over Europe will not move, you have to understand that a heat wave and a heat dome are not the same thing. A heat wave is just a stretch of hot days. A heat dome is the structure that builds the heat wave and then traps it in place, and it is one of the most efficient heat manufacturing machines in all of atmospheric science. Picture the atmosphere above your head as having weather systems that move through it, areas of low pressure that bring storms and clouds and rain, and areas of high pressure that bring calm, clear, sinking air. A heat dome is an enormous, powerful dome of high pressure that sets up in the upper atmosphere and sits there, often spanning hundreds of thousands of square miles, and the physics of what happens underneath it are brutal in their simplicity. Under high pressure, air sinks. As that air sinks toward the surface, it gets compressed by the weight of the atmosphere above it, and compressed air heats up. This is not a metaphor. It is the same principle that makes a bicycle pump warm when you pump it hard. Squeeze a gas, and its temperature rises. So you have an entire column of air, miles deep, sinking and warming as it descends day after day. That sinking air also dries out, which is why heat domes bring those cloudless, glaring skies. And cloudless skies mean nothing is blocking the sun. Every bit of solar energy that reaches the top of the atmosphere pours straight down to the ground. Now the ground heats up under that relentless sun, and the hot ground radiates its heat back up into the air. But the dome is acting like a lid. The high pressure caps the atmosphere, trapping that rising heat instead of letting it vent away. So the heat that pours in during the day gets locked in, and the next day more pours in on top of it, and the temperature ratchets higher and higher with each cycle. The dome is essentially a one-way valve for energy. Heat goes in, heat does not come out. And the longer the dome sits in one place, the more extreme the temperatures underneath it become. This is why duration is everything with a heat dome, and why the forecasters are not just worried about how hot it will get on a single afternoon, but about how many days the dome will hold. A 2-day heat dome is dangerous. A 10-day heat dome is a catastrophe, because it gives the system time to compound. Each day builds on the last. The ground bakes drier, which means even less of the sun's energy goes into evaporating moisture, and even more goes straight into raising the temperature. The nights stay hot because the trapped air never clears. It feeds on itself. And this brings us back to those tropical nights, because they are not a separate problem from the heat dome. They are a direct product of it. Normally, after a hot day, the ground radiates its heat away into space overnight, and the temperature falls. Clear skies should actually help that process. But under a strong heat dome, the air mass is so deep and so warm, and the heat trapped within it so immense that even a full night of radiating cannot drain it. The temperature falls a little and then stalls out far above where it should be, and dawn arrives with the system already hot, ready to climb again. That is how you end up with an overnight low of 86 degrees on the Spanish coast. The dome will not let the night do its job. So a heat dome is a machine that compresses air to heat it, removes the clouds so the sun can add even more heat, and then caps the whole system so the heat cannot escape, all while sitting in one place long enough for the effect to snowball. When you hear that Europe is under a heat dome, that is the engine running over the continent right now. There is one more layer that makes the cities underneath these domes especially deadly, and it is something most people never think about. Cities are hotter than the countryside around them, sometimes dramatically so, because all that asphalt, concrete, brick and stone soaks up the sun's heat during the day and then radiates it back out slowly all night long. A neighbourhood of dark pavement and dense buildings can run several degrees warmer than a leafy suburb just a few miles away, and far warmer than open land beyond the city. Scientists call this the urban heat island, and it is at its most dangerous at night, because while the countryside finally cools, the concrete city keeps breathing heat back into the air long after sunset. So when a heat dome parks over a major city, it stacks the dome's trapped heat on top of the city's own stored heat, and the result is that the urban core barely cools at all overnight. That is exactly the killing mechanism we keep coming back to, the night that never lets the body recover, and it is concentrated most intensely in the dense, paved, lower-income parts of cities where the most vulnerable people often live, frequently with the least access to cooling. The dome is the engine, the city is the amplifier bolted onto it. But this raises the real question, the one that actually matters for everything that follows. If a heat dome is just a big area of high pressure, and high pressure systems form and dissolve and drift across the planet all the time, then why does this one refuse to move? High pressure is not unusual. What is unusual, what turns an ordinary ridge of high pressure into a stationary, record-breaking, deadly heat dome, is when something locks it in place and tells it to stay. Something has to hold the dome still long enough for the compounding to happen. Something has to jam the normal movement of the atmosphere, and that something is not over Europe at all. It is thousands of feet above the continent, a current of air that wraps the entire Northern Hemisphere, and the way it has been behaving in recent decades is the actual reason heat domes are getting stronger, lasting longer, and showing up in places that are not built to survive them. It is also, and this is the part I really need you to hold on to, the precise physical link between what is happening over Europe and what is about to happen over America. The dome is the local symptom. The thing controlling the dome is global. To see how Europe's disaster becomes America's, we have to go up into the fast river of air that decides where these domes form and how long they stay. We have to talk about the jet stream and about something disturbing that scientists have discovered it has started doing. Part 4. The river in the sky that stopped moving. High above your head, around the altitude where passenger jets cruise, there is a river of air that circles the entire Northern Hemisphere from west to east. We call it the jet stream, and even though you cannot see it, it is one of the most important features on the planet for deciding what kind of day you're going to have. It is the boundary between the cold air of the Arctic to the north and the warm air of the subtropics to the south, and it can scream along at well over 100 miles an hour. The jet stream exists because of a temperature difference. Cold air is dense and heavy, warm air is lighter, and where the cold polar air meets the warmer air to the south, that contrast in temperature creates a powerful wind high in the atmosphere. The bigger the temperature difference between the pole and the mid-latitudes, the stronger and the straighter that jet stream runs. And when the jet stream is strong and straight, it acts like a conveyor belt, pushing weather systems along briskly from west to east. A hot spell shows up, and a few days later, the jet sweeps it onward and replaces it with something else. Nothing sits still for long. The atmosphere keeps moving. But the jet stream does not always run straight. It can develop large waves, enormous looping meanders that swing far to the north and then dive far to the south, like a river developing big bends as it crosses a flat plain. These waves have a name. Scientists call them Rossby waves, and when the jet stream is strong, those waves ripple along and keep moving. But when the jet stream weakens, something dangerous happens. The waves slow down. They grow larger and more sluggish, and sometimes they stop moving altogether and lock into place. Here is why that is the whole ball game. When a giant northward bend in the jet stream parks itself over a region, it pulls hot subtropical air far to the north and traps a dome of high pressure underneath it. The jet stream, instead of sweeping that heat dome along, wraps around it and pins it in place. The bend acts like a set of brakes clamping down on the atmosphere, and there is your answer to the question from a moment ago. The reason Europe's heat dome will not move is that the jet stream above it has stalled into one of these locked looping patterns, and it is holding the dome in place like a hand pressing down on a lid. Now we arrive at the discovery that genuinely unsettles the scientists who study this, and at the specific reason Europe keeps getting hit harder than almost anywhere else. Over the past several decades, Western Europe has been heating up and racking up heat waves 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the northern mid-latitudes, not a little faster, 3 to 4 times faster than comparable regions at the same latitude. Europe has become a heatwave hotspot, an outlier on the map, a place where the trend line is bending upward far more steeply than the average. Of the 30 most severe heat waves to strike Europe between 1950 and 2023, 23 of them happened after the year 2000. The disasters are not spread evenly across the decades, they are clustering hard in recent years. For a long time, that was a genuine puzzle. Climate change alone, the steady background warming of the whole planet, could not explain why Europe specifically was pulling so far ahead of everywhere else. And then research published in the journal Nature Communications in 2022 found the missing piece, and it points straight back to the jet stream. The researchers identified a particular configuration called a double jet state. Instead of a single jet stream, the current splits into 2 branches, one to the north and one to the south, with a zone of weak, stagnant air trapped in between. And when that split pattern sets up over Eurasia and persists, the air over Europe simply sits and bakes. The study found that these persistent double jet states have been lasting longer over the years, and that they explain almost the entire upward trend in Western European heat waves. Not part of it, almost all of it. So Europe is not just unlucky, it sits in exactly the place where the jet stream is most prone to splitting and stalling in this particular way, and that tendency has been getting worse. The machine has a preferred address, and it is the European continent. To really grasp why these patterns lock up, it helps to think about what those giant bends in the jet stream actually are. They are waves, in the truest sense, the same kind of standing wave you can set up in a length of rope, by shaking one end at the right rhythm. The atmosphere has its own natural rhythms, and under certain conditions the waves in the jet stream can fall into a kind of resonance, where instead of marching along and dissipating, they grow larger and lock into place, held steady by the geometry of the whole hemisphere. Scientists studying this have found that when the jet settles into particular wave shapes, with a certain number of ridges and troughs wrapped around the globe, those patterns can become self-sustaining for weeks, parking the same weather over the same regions far longer than anything in the historical record would suggest is normal. A locked wave does not just produce one heat dome. It produces a fixed arrangement of heat here, drought there, flooding somewhere else, all frozen in place at once. This is the part that genuinely worries the people who study the jet stream, because a faster, healthier jet almost never gets stuck like this. Resonant locked patterns are far more likely when the jet is weak and sluggish, which is exactly the direction the warming Arctic has been pushing it. So it is not only that Europe sits in the jet's favourite place to split, it is that the whole hemisphere's jet stream is becoming more prone to falling into these stuck, resonant configurations in the first place, which means more frequent, longer-lasting, more extreme stalled patterns everywhere the jet flows. And because it is one continuous current, when it locks for Europe, it is locking a complementary pattern into place for everyone else along its path at the same moment. That is the link, made physical. Not a vague analogy between 2 hot places, but a single wave structure in a single river of air, holding heat over 2 continents at once. But why is the jet stream weakening and stalling more often in the first place? Here we reach the deepest layer of the story, and it connects everything happening over Europe to the entire planet. Remember that the jet stream is powered by the temperature contrast between the cold Arctic and the warmer air to the south. Well, the Arctic is not warming at the global average rate. It is warming roughly twice as fast as the rest of the world. The far north is heating up dramatically, and as it does, the temperature difference between the pole and the mid-latitudes shrinks. And when that contrast shrinks, the engine that drives the jet stream loses power. The jet slows down. and a slow jet stream is a wavy, loopy, sluggish jet stream, far more likely to develop those big stalling bends and those persistent double jet splits that lock heat domes in place for days or weeks at a time. This is the chain of cause and effect, start to finish. The Arctic warms faster than everywhere else. The temperature contrast that powers the jet stream weakens. The jet slows and becomes wavy and prone to splitting. Those stalled split patterns trap heat domes over the continents and hold them there. And the heat domes, sitting motionless, compound day after day into the kind of record-breaking deadly heat that is breaking over Europe right now. Europe feels it first and worst because of where it sits, right next to the fastest warming region on the planet and directly in the path of the jet stream's favourite place to stall. And now you can see why I keep insisting that this is not really a European story. The jet stream is not a European feature. It is a single, continuous current that wraps the entire Northern Hemisphere. The same slowing, the same waviness, the same tendency to lock into stalled patterns is happening all the way around the globe. When a giant bend parks over Europe and bakes the continent, the very same wave pattern is sending complementary bends and ridges and troughs marching across North America. The machine that is cooking Europe is the same machine that hangs over your head. Europe is just the spot where it has chosen to show its worst face this week. So the obvious, uncomfortable question becomes this. If the jet stream is one continuous river circling the hemisphere, and it has learned to stall, and it is stalling over Europe right now with terrifying results, then where is it stalling next, and what is it about to do to the 170 million people on the other side of the Atlantic who are already feeling the first edge of the heat? To answer that, we have to follow the machine westward. But before we cross the ocean, we need to understand exactly why Europe, of all places, became the planet's early warning system, because that is the key that unlocks everything America is about to face. Part 5. Why Europe burns first. We have established that there is a machine, and that the machine is the stalling jet stream, and that Europe sits in its favourite place to stall. But I want to slow down here and make this concrete, because the idea that Europe functions as the planet's early warning system is the single most important concept in this entire story, and it is the bridge to everything that is coming for America. Start with geography. Europe sits at a surprisingly high latitude. People do not always realise this, because Europe's climate has historically been mild, kept gentle by the warm waters of the Atlantic. But look at a globe, and you will see that Paris sits farther north than Montreal. London is farther north than the entire contiguous United States. Madrid is roughly level with New York City, and most of Europe stretches up well beyond that. Europe is, in plain terms, a northern place. And being a northern place puts it close to the Arctic, which matters enormously, because the Arctic is the fastest warming region on the entire planet. We said the Arctic is warming about twice as fast as the global average, and that this is what saps the strength of the jet stream. But sitting right next door to that runaway warming has a second effect on Europe. The continent is directly downwind and downrange of the part of the world where the climate is changing most violently. When the engine of the jet stream falters because the Arctic is heating up, Europe is the first large, densely populated landmass to feel the consequences, because it is the closest one to the source of the disruption. The continent is standing nearest to the fire. Then layer on the jet stream physics we just worked through. The double jet state, that splitting of the current into two branches with a stagnant dead zone in between, has a strong tendency to set up over Eurasia specifically. The geography of the continents, the position of the mountains, the layout of the oceans, all of it conspires to make the airspace over Europe one of the planet's preferred locations for the jet stream to split and stall. So Europe gets a double penalty. It sits closest to the Arctic disruption that weakens the jet, and it sits in the exact zone where the weakened jet most likes to lock into its most dangerous heat-trapping configuration. That is why the numbers look the way they do. That is why Western Europe is heating 3 to 4 times faster than comparable regions at its latitude. That is why 23 of the 30 worst European heatwaves since 1950 have struck since the year 2000. Europe is not experiencing a string of bad luck. It is experiencing the leading edge of a planetary trend sharpened to a point by its geography. The continent is where the future arrives early. And this is precisely why the rest of us should be watching, rather than scrolling past a headline about hot weather somewhere far away. When a system fails, it fails first at its weakest, most exposed point. Europe is that point for Northern Hemisphere heat. The records breaking in France and Britain this week are not just local tragedies. They are a readout from the most sensitive instrument on the planet, and that instrument is screaming. Look at what it is telling us, right now, in real numbers. The United Kingdom is on the verge of erasing a June temperature record that has stood untouched since 1976, and not by a hair, but by several degrees. France may record its hottest day in its entire history of measurement in June, weeks before summer even reaches its climatological peak. Spain is enduring overnight temperatures that never fall below the high 80s Fahrenheit. These are not incremental changes. These are the kinds of jumps that, a generation ago, would have been dismissed as impossible, as errors in the data. And they are happening in the place built to notice them first. There is something almost merciful, in a dark way, about Europe being the early warning system, because it means the rest of us get to see what is coming before it arrives. We get a preview. The terrible thing about a preview, though, is only useful if you actually watch it and change what you do next. And here is where I have to be honest about the trajectory, because this is the part people get wrong in both directions. The people who panic get it wrong because this is not the end of the world, and treating every heatwave as the apocalypse just exhausts everyone until they stop listening. But the people who shrug get it wrong too, and they get it wrong in a more dangerous way, because they treat each record as a one-off. They say, well, it was hot, it broke a record, records are made to be broken, and then they forget. What they miss is that the records are not scattering randomly, they are marching in one direction. Each decade's unthinkable extreme becomes the next decade's bad summer, and then the decade after that it becomes ordinary. The 1976 record that Britain is about to shatter stood for nearly 50 years. The record being set this week may not stand for 5. This is what scientists mean when they say the baseline is moving. It is not that summers got a little hotter and then settled into a new, stable normal. It is that the entire distribution is sliding, year after year, decade after decade, dragged along by the warming Arctic and the stalling jet. There is no new normal to settle into because the ground keeps moving under your feet. The worst case of one generation becomes the baseline of the next, and Europe, sitting at the front of that procession, is showing us the next few steps before we take them. Which brings us, finally, to the ocean crossing. Because if Europe is the early warning system, then the warning has been delivered, loud and unmistakable, and the only question left is whether the place it is warning is paying attention. The jet stream that is stalling over Europe does not stop at the Atlantic. It keeps going, all the way around the hemisphere, across the ocean, over the place where 170 million people are about to find out whether the lesson Europe is teaching this week applies to them too. It does. And the early signs are already showing up in the American data right now today. So let us cross the ocean and look at what the same machine is building over the United States. Part 6. America on the same fault line. Here is the part of the story that should make every American sit up, because it turns a foreign headline into a forecast for your own backyard. At the very moment Europe is buckling under this heat dome, forecasters in the United States are watching a heat dome of America's own take shape, one that they expect to put roughly 170 million people under dangerous heat in the weeks ahead. That is about half the country, half the United States, under the same kind of structure that is breaking records across Europe, driven by the same stalled, wavy jet stream we have spent this whole video taking apart. This is not a coincidence, and it is not me forcing a connection to make a point. It is the direct, physical consequence of what the jet stream is. Remember, it is one continuous river of air circling the whole Northern Hemisphere. When it develops those giant stalling waves, it does not develop just one. It develops a whole train of them, ridges and troughs alternating around the globe. A towering ridge of high pressure parks over Europe and bakes the continent, and downstream, across the Atlantic, the same wave pattern throws up another ridge over North America. The two heat domes are not separate weather events. They are different crests of the same wave, riding the same crippled jet stream. Europe is feeling one crest this week, America is moving under another, and the specifics coming out of the American forecasts are sobering. In parts of Texas, forecasters are warning of heat index values, the combination of temperature and humidity that tells you what the heat actually does to a human body, reaching 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Across the Northeast, in cities like Newark and Philadelphia, the forecast called for something that had never happened before in June: 3 consecutive nights where the overnight low never dropped below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. There are those tropical nights again, the exact mechanism that is killing people on the Spanish coast. The failure of the night to bring relief is now appearing in the American forecast for the first time on record. And think about where that is happening. The corridor from Washington up through Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and into New England is one of the most densely populated stretches of the entire country. Tens of millions of people packed into older cities full of brick row homes and apartment buildings that hold heat. Many of them built long before central air conditioning was standard. It is also a region that, like the Pacific Northwest, does not carry a deep cultural memory of surviving extreme heat, because historically it has not had to. When the forecast for that corridor starts including the first 3-night run of 80-degree overnight lows ever recorded, it is describing the precise conditions in precisely the kind of dense, aging, vulnerable urban environment that turned into a mass casualty event in Chicago. The Northeast is not the desert Southwest, where heat is at least expected and planned for. It is closer to the profile of the places that have been caught off guard, and it is where a huge share of the country's population and a huge share of its oldest and most isolated residents actually live. A heat dome that settles over that corridor is a heat dome sitting on top of one of the largest concentrations of heat-vulnerable people in the developed world. Step back and look at the seasonal picture, and it gets broader still. The summer outlook for 2026 calls for hotter-than-average conditions across nearly the entire continental United States, with almost no region expected to come in below its historical average for the season. The most extreme heat relative to normal is aimed at the West and the Pacific Northwest, across California, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. And if those place names ring a bell, they should, because that is almost exactly the region that suffered through one of the most shocking heat disasters in modern North American history just a few years ago, an event we are going to come back to, because it is the clearest proof that what is happening to Europe can happen here. I do not want this to feel like a distant forecast, some abstract projection for a summer that has not started yet, so let me ground it in what is actually being measured today, on the same day this European heat dome is making headlines. Look at the United States right now. The Pacific Northwest is running near record highs, with heat advisories stretching from the Seattle area southward, and at least one city closing in on a record that has stood since the early 1990s. Down in Texas, the city of Houston is seeing heat index values climbing toward 107 degrees. In South Florida, the official designation is major heat risk, with heat index values between 103 and 106 degrees, the kind of conditions that pose a real threat to vulnerable people. Southern California is heading into its own heat advisory. This is not a forecast for later. This is the American edge of the same global pattern, and it is already here. And the strain does not stop at human bodies, because a heat dome of this scale puts the machinery of modern life under enormous pressure at the exact moment people depend on it most. When tens of millions of air conditioners switch on at once across a region, demand on the electrical grid spikes toward its limits, and heat itself degrades the grid's ability to deliver because power lines sag and lose capacity when they are hot, and transformers strain in the heat. The cruel arithmetic is that the moment people most need power to survive is the moment the grid is most likely to fail, and a blackout during a severe heat dome is not an inconvenience. It is a mass casualty risk, because it strips away the one defense many people have. The American West has already been getting a preview of its own. Earlier this year, a heat event across the Southwest was severe enough that it was ranked among the most astonishing weather events of the century by the people who track such things, and separate analysis found that record-shattering spring temperatures across western North America would have been virtually impossible without the background warming we've been describing. These are not isolated curiosities. They are the same trends showing up on the American side of the ocean, the curve bending upward over here just as it is over Europe. So when the summer outlook points the most extreme heat at the West and the Pacific Northwest, it is pointing at a region that has already been demonstrating event after event that it sits right at the leading edge of this on the American continent, in the same way Europe does on its own. Now at the one ingredient that has the forecasters most uneasy, the wild card sitting underneath all of this. In the Pacific Ocean, a new El Niño is developing and strengthening. For those who have followed this channel, you know we have spent real time on this, most recently in our video on whether the strongest El Niño in recorded history may have begun, and before that when we looked at the Pacific smashing heat records faster than the models predicted. El Niño is a periodic warming of the surface waters of the tropical Pacific, and when it sets in, it pumps additional heat into the global atmosphere and reshuffles weather patterns around the world. The official index that tracks it has been climbing steadily, swinging from clearly cool conditions just months ago into warm territory now, and the trend is pointed sharply upward. What that means in practice is that the United States is heading into a summer of stalled, heat-trapping jet stream patterns at the same time that the Pacific is loading extra heat into the entire system. You have two amplifiers, and they are stacking on top of each other. The wavy stalling jet provides the structure, the heat domes that lock in place and compound. And El Niño provides the fuel, raising the background temperature that those domes are building on top of. It is like turning up the thermostat in the whole house while also sealing all the windows. Either one alone is a problem. Together, they are why the people who study this for a living are watching the months ahead with attention you do not usually hear in a weather briefing. And there is a cruel detail in the timing that makes early season heat especially dangerous, something the National Weather Service has been at pains to emphasize. Human beings acclimate to heat. Over the course of a summer, your body gradually adapts, your cardiovascular system adjusts, you build a tolerance. But that adaptation takes weeks, and it has not happened yet in June. An early season heatwave hits bodies that are still tuned for spring, that have not built up their defenses, and that makes a given temperature in June more dangerous than the very same temperature would be in August. Europe is being hit early, America is about to be hit early, and neither population has had time to adjust. So here is where we stand. The same jet stream that is stalling over Europe is stalling over America. The same kind of heat dome that is breaking European records is forming over the United States. 170 million Americans are in its path. A strengthening El Niño is loading extra heat into the whole system, and the population has not had time to acclimate. Every single ingredient that makes Europe's current disaster so deadly is present in some form on the American side of the Atlantic. But maybe you are still thinking that America is different, that it is bigger, richer, more spread out, more air-conditioned, that whatever happens to Europe could never happen on the same scale here. It is a comforting thought, and it is exactly the thought that was being thought by exactly the people you would expect right before the heat already came for America once, and killed on a scale almost no one saw coming. To understand what this summer could really hold, we have to go back, not to Europe, but to two places on American and Canadian soil where this exact machine has already done its worst. Part 7. It has happened here before. In the last week of June, in the year 2021, a heat dome formed over the Pacific Northwest of the United States and the western edge of Canada, and what it did there should permanently end the idea that this kind of disaster only happens to other people, in other places. The Pacific Northwest is not a region built for extreme heat. It is famous for its mild, damp, grey weather, its evergreen forests and its cool summers. Air conditioning, historically, was something many people in Seattle and Portland and the interior of British Columbia simply did not have because they had never needed it, in almost exactly the same way that most European homes were built without it. The buildings, the infrastructure, the bodies, the expectations, all of it was tuned for a temperate climate. And then, over a few days at the end of June, the temperate climate vanished and was replaced by something out of the deep desert. The numbers from that event still look like misprints. In the small village of Lytton, British Columbia, the temperature reached 49.6 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that is 121.3 degrees. That was not just a local record, it was the highest temperature ever reliably recorded in the entire country of Canada, a nation most of the world associates with snow and cold. A village in Canada hit a temperature you would expect in Death Valley, and the story of Lytton did not end with the record, because the day after it set their all-time national high, the village was consumed by a wildfire and largely destroyed. The heat set the record, and then the heat helped burn the town off the map. Lytton became the symbol of the whole event, a place that touched the hottest temperature in Canadian history, and then ceased, in a matter of hours, to exist. The infrastructure of the region failed in ways that read like science fiction. Roads buckled and cracked as the asphalt expanded in heat it was never engineered to withstand. Power cables physically melted. Transit systems shut down because the equipment could not function. The built environment of a wealthy, modern part of the developed world simply was not designed for that level of heat, because in all of recorded history it had never needed to be, and when the heat arrived it broke the physical systems people relied on at the very moment they needed them most. This is the hidden danger of records that shatter rather than nudge. Every piece of infrastructure, every building code, every power line and the rail and road was engineered with a ceiling in mind, and when the heat blows past that ceiling, things that were never supposed to fail begin failing all at once. What the scientists did afterward matters just as much as what the heat did. They went back and ran the event through climate models, comparing a world with human-caused warming to a simulated world without it, and the conclusion was stark. In a world that had not been warmed, that heat dome would have been so unlikely as to be effectively impossible, an event you might expect once in many thousands of years. The warming did not gently nudge the odds. It took something that should have been all but unthinkable and made it real, in a populated region, in our lifetimes. And the same analysis keeps producing the same kind of answer for event after event around the world, which is precisely why a single hot week stops being dismissible as random noise once you see how the attribution math keeps landing in the same place. But the symbol is not the body count, and the body count is what matters. Across the region, the death toll from that heat dome is estimated to have exceeded 1,400 people. In British Columbia alone, the provincial coroner confirmed 619 heat-related deaths during the most intense stretch of the event. Hundreds more died across Oregon and Washington. People died in their apartments. They died in mobile homes that turned into ovens. They died, overwhelmingly, the same way the victims in Europe died in 2003. Older, often alone, without air conditioning, in a built environment that had never been designed to keep heat out, caught by a level of heat that the place had no cultural memory of and no infrastructure to withstand. And here is the detail that ties it directly to everything we have built in this video. Scientists who went back and analysed that 2021 heat dome concluded that, in a world without human-caused climate change, it would have been something on the order of a 1 in 10,000 year event. A 1 in 10,000 year event. That is the statistical way of saying it should have been all but impossible. It was so far outside the range of anything the region had experienced that the normal tools for describing rare weather almost broke trying to account for it. And yet it happened, driven by exactly the structure we have been describing, a powerful heat dome locked in place by a stalled, contorted jet stream, sitting over a region with no defences. The Pacific Northwest is not Europe, but the machine did not care. It built the same dome, trapped the same heat, and killed in the same pattern. The only thing that changed was the address. And now look back at what we said a few minutes ago about the American summer outlook for 2026. The region forecast to see the most extreme heat relative to normal this summer is the West and the Pacific Northwest. The same corner of the continent that suffered the 1 in 10,000 year disaster is the corner the forecasters are most concerned about, in a year with a stalling jet stream and a strengthening El Niño both pushing in the same direction. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it is the truth the data is telling us. What 2021 proved is that the comforting story Americans tell themselves, the story that says we are too big or too rich or too modern for a European-scale heat catastrophe, is exactly as false as the same story was for the people who built Lytton without air conditioning. The heat does not check your passport or your GDP. It finds the gap between the climate a place was built for and the climate it actually has, and it pours into that gap. Europe had that gap in 2003. The Pacific Northwest had it in 2021, and the question for this summer is how many other places across America have a gap they do not yet know about. But the heat does not only kill in places that lack air conditioning because they never expected to need it. It also kills in the middle of a major American city that absolutely should have known better, where the air conditioning existed but the people who needed it could not or would not turn it on. To understand the deepest truth about how this heat actually kills, and why the coming American summer is as much a social question as a meteorological one, we have to go back to one brutal week in Chicago. Part 8. The City That Cooked. In July of 1995, a heatwave settled over Chicago, and in the span of about 5 days it killed 739 people, 739 dead in one American city in less than a week. The morgue ran out of room. The county had to bring in refrigerated trucks to hold the bodies, because the medical examiner's office simply could not handle the volume of dead arriving day after day. It remains one of the deadliest weather disasters in the history of the city, and almost everything about it is a warning for what is coming. What makes Chicago different from Lytton, and different from the European villages of 2003, is that Chicago is a dense, modern, air-conditioned American metropolis. The technology to survive the heat existed. It was in the walls. Most buildings had air conditioning, or could have, and people still died by the hundreds. To understand why is to understand the part of this story that no amount of forecasting can fix, the part that lives in how a society is actually organised. The victims of the Chicago heat wave were overwhelmingly the elderly poor. They were people living alone, often on the upper floors of apartment buildings where heat collects, in neighbourhoods where they were afraid to open their windows at night because they were afraid of crime. They were people who had air conditioning units but could not afford the electricity to run them, or who did not turn them on out of a lifetime of frugality, of not wanting to waste money. They were people who had outlived their spouses and their friends, whose children had moved away, who had no one stopping by to check whether the apartment had become deadly. The same factor that drove the European deaths in 2003 drove the Chicago deaths in 1995: isolation. The heat found the people nobody was watching. A sociologist later went back and studied the Chicago disaster in extraordinary detail, comparing neighbourhoods that should have had similar death tolls but did not, and what he found was that the places where people survived were the places with social connection. Neighbourhoods with busy sidewalks, with shops people walked to, with active community life, where neighbours knew each other, and an old man living alone was someone whose absence would be noticed. In those places people knocked on doors, they checked on each other, they got the vulnerable to cooling centres. In the isolated, emptied-out neighbourhoods, where there was no reason to walk outside and no one to notice silence, people died alone behind locked doors. The difference between life and death in the same city, in the same heat, came down to whether the social fabric was intact. This is the truth that sits underneath the entire story, and it is why I keep saying the coming American summer is not only a weather question. The temperature on the thermometer is the trigger, but the death toll is written by something else, by how old and how isolated and how poor and how unprepared the people in the heat's path happen to be. Heat is the most socially revealing of all disasters. A tornado or a flood strikes a place and takes whoever is there. Heat is more selective. It moves through a city and pulls out the lonely, the elderly, the people running their lives on the financial edge who cannot afford to cool a single room. It exposes exactly who a society has left behind. Now hold that next to where America is heading this summer. We're talking about 170 million people under a heat dome. We're talking about the first 3-night stretch of 80-degree nights ever forecast for cities like Newark and Philadelphia, the exact tropical night mechanism that does the killing. We are talking about an aging population, about rising numbers of people living alone, about communities where the social connection that saved lives in 1995 has frayed in a lot of places rather than strengthened. The meteorological ingredients for a mass casualty heat event are assembling. Whether they turn into one depends on the things Chicago taught us, on whether people check on the elderly neighbour, on whether the cooling centres open and people can actually get to them, on whether a society that has spent decades growing more isolated can find its neighbours in time. Europe, to its credit, learned this lesson the hardest possible way, and built systems around it. The red alerts flashing across France this week, the registries of vulnerable people, the public cooling spaces, all of it exists because 70,000 deaths forced the continent to take heat seriously as a killer. The uncomfortable question is whether America has built the same defences, or whether large parts of the country are still living in the mental world of 1995, treating heat as discomfort rather than as the deadliest weather hazard there is. Because heat, quietly, kills more Americans in a typical year than hurricanes, tornadoes and floods combined. It just does it slowly, indoors, out of sight, one isolated person at a time, which is exactly why it never gets the attention it deserves. Think about how differently we treat the other hazards. A hurricane gets a name, a category, days of wall-to-wall coverage, mandatory evacuations, and a clear before and after. A tornado leaves a visible scar across a town that television crews can stand in front of. Heat leaves no wreckage you can photograph. There is no debris field, no flattened neighbourhood, no dramatic footage of the moment of impact. The victims die quietly, often alone, often days after the hottest temperature has already passed, and they are counted later in the cold language of excess mortality statistics that arrive weeks after the cameras have moved on. That invisibility is not a minor detail. It is the reason heat is chronically underestimated by the public and underfunded by the systems meant to protect us, even though it quietly outkills the flashier disasters. A threat you cannot photograph is a threat people struggle to take seriously, and a heat dome is the most photogenically empty disaster there is. It is just a clear blue sky, day after day, and a rising count of the dead that nobody sees until it is over. So we have the machine, and we have the proof that it has already killed on American soil, and we have the social truth of who it takes. But there is one more piece of the physical story I have to put in front of you, because it changes how you should think about the limits of human survival itself. For a long time, scientists believed they knew the exact temperature at which heat becomes unsurvivable for a human being, no matter how healthy you are. It turns out they were wrong, and the real number is lower and closer than almost anyone realized. That number is the next thing you need to understand. Part 9. The number that should scare you. For decades, there was a number that scientists used to mark the absolute outer limit of human heat survival, the line past which no amount of fitness or hydration or shade could save you. That number was a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, and recent research suggests that number was wrong, that the true limit is meaningfully lower, and understanding why is one of the most important things you can take away from this entire story. First, let me explain what a wet bulb temperature even is, because it is not the number you see on a normal thermometer, and the difference is the whole point. A regular thermometer measures the air temperature, what we call the dry bulb temperature. A wet bulb thermometer is wrapped in a wet cloth, and as the water evaporates off that cloth, it cools the thermometer down, exactly the way sweat evaporating off your skin cools your body. So the wet bulb temperature tells you how much cooling you can actually get from evaporation in a given environment. And evaporation is the only real tool the human body has against extreme heat. When you are too hot, you sweat, and the sweat evaporates, and that evaporation carries heat away from your skin. It is your one and only emergency cooling system. Here is the catch. Evaporation only works if the air is dry enough to accept the moisture. When the air is bone dry, sweat evaporates fast and you can shed enormous amounts of heat, which is why a very hot but very dry desert is survivable in a way that feels almost counterintuitive. But when the air is already saturated with moisture, when the humidity is brutally high, your sweat cannot evaporate because the air has no room left to take it in. The sweat just sits on your skin and drips off, useless, while your core temperature climbs. The wet bulb temperature captures exactly this. It combines heat and humidity into a single number that tells you whether your body's cooling system can still function. The old theory held that once the wet bulb temperature reached 35 degrees Celsius, which is 95 degrees Fahrenheit at full saturation, the human body could no longer shed heat at all, and that a healthy person would die after about 6 hours of exposure, even sitting still in the shade with unlimited water. That was the textbook limit. But that limit was based on theory and physical modelling, not on actual measurements of real human beings. So researchers at Penn State decided to test it directly by putting young, healthy volunteers in a controlled chamber and carefully raising the heat and humidity to find the point where their bodies could no longer keep their core temperature stable. What they found was alarming. The real limit was not 35 degrees wet bulb. For young, healthy adults, it was closer to 31 degrees Celsius wet bulb, which works out to around 87 degrees Fahrenheit at full humidity. And remember, these were young, fit test subjects, the people most able to withstand heat. For older adults, whose bodies regulate temperature far less effectively, the survivable limit is lower still. The line that everyone thought marked the edge of human endurance was actually drawn several degrees too high, which means dangerous conditions arrive sooner, at lower temperatures, than the old science assumed. And the real world has been confirming this in the worst way. Deadly heat events in places like Seville, Phoenix, Mecca, and Bangkok have killed thousands of people without the wet bulb temperature ever getting anywhere near the old 35-degree limit. People were dying well below the theoretical line, because the theoretical line was never right in the first place. The threshold for mass death from heat is lower and more reachable, than the textbook said. Now connect this back to the two faces of the heat we have been discussing. The European heat dome right now is largely a dry heat, with extreme air temperatures but relatively low humidity, and dry heat, as deadly as it is, at least lets the body sweat effectively. But a great deal of the United States does not get dry heat. The Gulf Coast, the Southeast, the Mississippi Valley, large parts of the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard, these are humid places. When a heat dome parks over the humid American interior or the Gulf states, it does not just raise the temperature, it raises the temperature on top of air that is already thick with moisture, and that combination is what drives the wet bulb number toward the limit. It is the difference between a hot oven and a hot steam room. The oven is dangerous. The steam room is the one that shuts your body down. What is happening inside the body in that steam room scenario is worth spelling out because it explains why humid heat can kill at temperatures that do not even sound that extreme. Your core temperature needs to stay within a narrow band, and when sweat can no longer evaporate, the body loses its only way to dump heat. The core temperature begins to climb, and as it does, the heart races to move more blood to the skin in a desperate attempt to cool down. Blood pressure can crash, and the organs that depend on a stable internal temperature start to fail. Heat stroke, in the end, is the body cooking from the inside while its emergency cooling system sits useless under air too wet to accept another drop of sweat. It can unfold in hours, and it does not require the headline-grabbing temperatures of a European record to do it. This is why the humid corridors of America deserve special attention as this summer unfolds. The Gulf Coast, the lower Mississippi Valley, the humid Southeast, and the crowded cities of the Eastern Seaboard do not need to reach the kinds of air temperatures Europe is seeing to become genuinely dangerous, because the moisture in the air does the work of pushing the wet bulb number toward that lower-than-expected limit. A temperature that would be merely uncomfortable in dry Arizona becomes life-threatening in humid Louisiana, because the body's escape hatch is sealed shut by the humidity, and the people most exposed are the same ones the heat always finds first: the elderly, the isolated, those without reliable cooling, those whose bodies have the least reserve to spend on a fight against their own rising temperature. This is why those heat index values we mentioned earlier, the 110 degrees forecast in Texas, the 107 in Houston, are not just big scary numbers. The heat index is essentially a measure of that same humid heat danger, the felt experience of temperature and humidity together. And when a humid American heat dome pushes the wet bulb temperature toward that lower-than-expected survival threshold, you do not need the air temperature to hit the apocalyptic numbers Europe is seeing. A lower air temperature, combined with high humidity, can be every bit as lethal, because it attacks the body's cooling system directly. We talked about this in our earlier video on when extreme heat becomes truly unsurvivable, and the research has only sharpened the picture since. The limit is closer than people think, and a lot of America lives in exactly the kind of humid environment where that limit can be reached. So the European heat dome is showing us the dry, record-shattering version of the threat, the one that produces the staggering temperature numbers. But the version waiting for much of America may be the humid one, the quieter one, the one that does its damage at lower temperatures by drowning the body's ability to cool itself. Both are products of the same stalled jet stream. They just kill through different doors. By now, if you have been with me this whole way, you might expect everyone to be on the same page about what is happening and why. But they are not. Because every time an event like this unfolds, a chorus rises up to insist that none of it is real, or that it is all being manufactured on purpose, or that the authorities are inventing a crisis to control you. Those claims deserve a real answer, not a sneer, because some of them sound convincing until you actually run the numbers, so let us take them on directly. Part 10. The Voices Saying It's Fake. Whenever a heat event like this dominates the headlines, a predictable set of alternative explanations floods in to compete with the boring physics of stalled jet streams and sinking air. And on this channel, we do not pretend those claims do not exist, and we do not just roll our eyes at the people asking the questions. We take the claims seriously enough to actually test them, because the best way to understand why the real explanation is true is to see precisely where the alternatives fall apart. So let us go through them, honestly, one at a time. The first and loudest claim is that these heat domes are being manufactured deliberately, that some government program is engineering the heat, often with a facility like the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, known as HIARP, named as the culprit. The idea is that powerful technology is being used to create and steer these enormous high-pressure systems. It is a dramatic story. And it collapses the instant you look at the energy involved. A continental-scale heat dome, the kind sitting over Europe right now, contains and moves a quantity of energy that is almost impossible to put into words. We are talking about the energy of the atmosphere over an entire continent, a figure that dwarfs the total energy output of all of human civilization combined by many orders of magnitude. A research facility broadcasting radio energy into the upper atmosphere operates at the scale of a few megawatts. The atmosphere it would supposedly be steering operates at a scale trillions upon trillions of times larger. Asking HAARP to create a heat dome is like asking a single hairdryer to redirect a hurricane. The mismatch is not close. It is 17 or more orders of magnitude off. There is no mechanism because there is nowhere near enough energy. The second claim is a cousin of the first, that the heat is being caused by solar geoengineering, by aircraft spraying aerosols into the sky, the idea often labelled with the word chemtrails. Here the problem is even more direct, because the actual physics of what spraying reflective aerosols into the atmosphere would do is the exact opposite of heating. Reflective particles in the upper atmosphere bounce sunlight back into space and cool the surface. That is the entire premise of why anyone proposes solar geoengineering in the first place, as a way to lower temperatures. If a secret program were genuinely seeding the stratosphere with aerosols at scale, the result would be cooling, not the record heat we are measuring. The claim asks you to believe a program is causing warming by deploying the one tool whose whole purpose is to cause cooling. It inverts the physics it depends on. The third claim is quieter and in a way more reasonable on its surface. It says, look, it is just summer, it gets hot in the summer, and these records are either exaggerated or the result of badly placed or manipulated thermometers. This one deserves real respect, because skepticism about data is healthy, and you should never just take a number on faith. So here is how you check it. The temperature records we are discussing are not coming from a single thermometer, or a single agency, or a single country. They are measured by thousands of independent weather stations, run by different national governments that do not coordinate their raw data, and they are cross-checked against satellite measurements that read the temperature of the atmosphere from orbit, using completely different physics than a ground thermometer. When the British Met Office, French Météo France, the Spanish and Italian and German services, and orbiting satellites all independently show the same extreme heat, you're not looking at a rigged thermometer. And the deepest answer to the just summer argument is the trend itself. Just summer cannot explain why 23 of Europe's 30 worst heat waves since 1950 have all landed after the year 2000. Random summer heat does not cluster like that. Something is bending the curve, and the clustering is the fingerprint. The fourth claim is about motive. It says the authorities are exaggerating the danger, issuing all these red alerts and closing schools and banning outdoor events in order to frighten and control the population. And the answer to this one is written in the morgues of 2003. Every single protective measure being deployed across Europe this week maps directly onto a known cause of death from past heat disasters. They ban outdoor alcohol because dehydration kills. They close schools because children and the buildings they sit in cannot handle the heat. They open cooling centres and check on isolated elderly people, because isolation was the single greatest predictor of death in 2003 and in Chicago in 1995. These are not arbitrary restrictions invented to test your obedience. They are a checklist written in the names of 70,000 dead Europeans, applied so that this time the number is smaller. The measures are reactive to a body count, not a pretext for control. So all four alternatives fail, and they fail for the same underlying reason. They are searching for a hidden hand, a secret cause, a villain pulling levers, when the actual explanation is sitting in plain sight and is in some ways more unsettling than any conspiracy. There is no secret program. There is just physics. A heat dome is well understood high pressure. A stalled jet stream is well understood fluid dynamics. The Arctic warming faster than everywhere else is measured directly, every day, by satellites and weather balloons and ground stations all over the world. But I want to be precise here, because there is a real and important truth buried inside the skeptic's instinct, and ignoring it would be its own kind of dishonesty. The pattern itself, the heat dome, the stalled jet, the Rossby wave locking into place, all of that is entirely natural. These patterns have always existed. The atmosphere has always thrown up ridges of high pressure, and the jet stream has always wandered. What has changed is not that humans invented these patterns. What has changed is the background they are operating against. We have warmed the planet, and we have warmed the Arctic fastest of all, and that has made the natural patterns more extreme, more frequent, and more prone to stalling. The honest framing is not that anyone is manufacturing the heat. It is that we have changed the conditions in which the heat forms so that the natural machine now runs hotter and gets stuck more often. Climate change is not the puppeteer, it is the amplifier. And that distinction is the difference between a comforting fantasy and the genuinely sobering reality. Which leaves us with the only question that actually matters now, the one this entire video has been building toward. If the machine is real, and it is not a conspiracy, and it is already breaking Europe while it assembles over America, then what specifically is the American summer about to become, and is there anything we can actually do about it? That is where we finish. Part 11. 2 amplifiers, 1 summer. When forecasters look at the months ahead for the United States, the thing that unsettles them is not any single number. It is the way 2 completely different forces are lining up to push in the same direction at the same time, each one making the other worse. We have met both of these forces already in this video, but I want to put them side by side now, because together they are the reason this summer carries a different weight than an ordinary hot season. The first amplifier is the one we have spent most of our time on, the stalled wavy jet stream. We have seen how the warming Arctic saps the strength of the jet, how a weaker jet develops those enormous looping bends, and how those bends lock heat domes in place over the continents for days and weeks instead of letting them slide harmlessly past. This is the structural amplifier. It is the thing that takes a hot spell and freezes it into a compounding, record-breaking heat dome, and it is operating across the whole Northern Hemisphere right now, which is why Europe and America are feeling crests of the same wave at the same time. The second amplifier is the one rising out of the Pacific Ocean, El Niño. We have followed this story closely on this channel, and the short version is that the surface waters of the tropical Pacific are warming, and a strengthening El Niño dumps additional heat into the global atmosphere, while it rearranges weather patterns across the planet. The official index tracking it has climbed steadily out of cool territory and into warm, and the trend is pointed up. This is the thermal amplifier. It does not build the heat domes, but it raises the entire temperature floor that those domes are constructed on top of. Every heat dome that forms this summer forms over a background that El Niño has already nudged warmer. El Niño does more than just add a little background warmth though, and this is the part that makes it such a wild card. It reaches across the entire planet and reshuffles the deck, shifting where the jet stream tends to set up, changing where storms track and where ridges build, altering rainfall and drought patterns on continents thousands of miles from the Pacific. Scientists call these long-distance ripple effects teleconnections, and they are the reason an unusual patch of warm water off the coast of South America can change the weather in North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia all at once. The strongest El Niño years in the historical record have lined up with some of the hottest years the planet has ever measured, precisely because the extra Pacific heat and the rearranged circulation patterns reinforce each other. So a strengthening El Niño is not just a thermostat being turned up. It is a dealer reshuffling the whole atmospheric deck at the same moment the jet stream is already prone to dealing stalled, heat-trapping hands. 2 systems, each capable of bending a season on its own, are leaning on the scale together. Now picture what happens when you stack these 2. The jet stream provides the structure, the locked-in domes that compound day after day. El Niño provides the fuel, the elevated baseline that every one of those domes starts from. A heat dome that might have produced a dangerous but survivable heat wave in a neutral year produces something more extreme when it is building on top of El Niño warmth. It is the difference between lighting a fire in a cool room and lighting the same fire in a room where someone has already cranked the thermostat. Same fire, very different outcome. The forecasters are not worried about one amplifier, they are worried about the multiplication of 2. And there is a timing dimension to this that makes it even more concerning. We are in June. June is not the peak of summer heat. The hottest stretch of the year, climatologically, comes later, in July and August. What that means is that the heat dome breaking records across Europe this week, and the one assembling over America, are arriving before the season has even reached its hottest baseline. This is the opening act. If the jet stream stays in its stalled, heat-trapping mood, and El Niño keeps strengthening as projected, Then the most dangerous heat of the year would arrive later, on top of an even hotter seasonal baseline, with both amplifiers running at full strength. June is showing us what the machine can do early. It is not showing us the ceiling. Layer on the acclimatization problem one more time, because it compounds the timing. Bodies adapt to heat slowly, over weeks. An early hit in June lands on populations that have not yet built their tolerance, which is exactly why early season events kill out of proportion to their temperature. But here is the darker turn of that same logic. A brutal early summer does not just hurt now, it sets the stage for everything after, because it arrives before people, infrastructure, and emergency systems have ramped up for the season. The power grid has not been fully tested. The cooling centres may not yet be staffed. The public has not yet shifted into summer survival mode. An early, severe heat dome catches the whole system flat-footed, and then the real heat of July and August arrives behind it. This is why, when you hear a forecaster use a word like terrified about what is coming, they are not reacting to a single hot Monday. They are looking at the architecture of the whole season, a hemisphere-wide jet stream stuck in its most dangerous configuration, a strengthening El Niño loading heat into the system, an early arrival that catches unacclimated bodies and unprepared infrastructure, and a peak that has not even come yet. They are looking at Europe breaking records weeks before midsummer and doing the arithmetic for what that implies on the American side of the same machine. And yet, for all of that, I do not want to leave you with the feeling that this is simply fate, that the number of people who die this summer is fixed and there is nothing to be done. Because the single clearest lesson from every one of these disasters, from 2003 in Europe to 2021 in the Pacific Northwest to 1995 in Chicago, is that the death toll is not determined by the temperature alone. The same heat, in two different communities, produces wildly different numbers of dead, depending entirely on how those communities are organised and how they respond. The machine decides how hot it gets. We still have an enormous amount of say in how many people it takes. That is the part worth understanding before the worst of the heat arrives, and it is where we turn next. Part 12. The difference between the places that live and the places that die. If you put the great heat disasters of the modern era side by side, a strange and ultimately hopeful pattern emerges from the wreckage. The temperature is never the whole story. In every single case, you can find two communities hit by nearly identical heat, and one buries a handful of people while the other buries hundreds. The heat is the trigger. But what decides the body count is everything we have built, or failed to build, around the people in its path. Go back to Chicago in 1995 because it remains the clearest natural experiment we have. The sociologist who studied that disaster found neighborhoods sitting right next to each other, with the same demographics, the same poverty, the same proportion of elderly residents, the same brutal temperature, and radically different death tolls. The thing that separated them was not income or air conditioning or even age, it was social connection. The neighborhoods where people survived were the ones with life on the streets, with shops within walking distance, with active community organizations, with neighbors who knew each other well enough to notice when someone had not been seen in a couple of days. In those places, people knocked on doors. They walked an elderly neighbor to a cooling center. They noticed the silence behind a door and called someone. In the emptied-out, isolated neighborhoods, the same heat killed many times more people because there was no one to notice and no reason for anyone to walk by. That finding should reframe how you think about this entire threat, because it means the most powerful protection against a heat disaster is not a piece of technology. It is the strength of the connections between people. It is whether the lonely elderly man on the third floor is someone whose absence registers. Europe understood this after 2003, which is why so much of the system it built is not about machinery, but about people, about registries of vulnerable residents and organised check-ins and making sure no one faces the heat completely alone. The red alerts flashing across France this week are not just telling people it is hot. They are activating a human network designed to reach the people the heat hunts. So when we ask whether America is ready for what is coming, the question is not really about whether the country has enough air conditioners. It is about whether the social fabric is intact enough to catch the people who fall through it. And that is a harder question because in a lot of places the fabric has thinned rather than thickened. More people live alone than ever before. The population is aging. Many communities have lost the walkable, connected texture that saved lives in 1995. The very thing that turns out to matter most has, in many places, been quietly eroding for decades. That is the real vulnerability underneath the American summer, and it is one no forecast can fix and no government alert can fully replace. But here is why this is, against all the grim numbers, genuinely the hopeful part of the story. Unlike the jet stream, unlike the Arctic, unlike El Niño, this is the one variable that ordinary people actually control. You cannot unstall the jet stream, you cannot cool the Arctic before this weekend, you cannot weaken El Niño, but you can know which of your neighbours is elderly and lives alone. You can decide before the worst heat arrives that you will check on them. You can be the connection that, in every one of these disasters, turned out to be the difference between a survivable event and a mass casualty one. The machine is vast and impersonal, and beyond any single person's reach. The thing that decides how many it takes is intimate and human and entirely within reach. There is a strange dignity in that when you sit with it. We're talking about a hemispheric atmospheric engine, a stalled river of air 30,000 feet up, an ocean warming half a world away, forces so large they are almost abstract. And the lever that actually moves the death toll, the one factor that separated life from death in Chicago and in Paris and in the Pacific Northwest, is whether one person bothered to knock on another person's door, the grander scale and the most human scale, meeting in the same disaster. And the watchfulness that matters does not require any special expertise, which is part of why it is so powerful. The warning signs of someone slipping into serious heat illness are visible to anyone paying attention. Confusion or strange behaviour, a stumbling unsteadiness, skin that has stopped sweating and turned hot and dry, a headache or nausea that will not ease. In the most dangerous stage, a person in heat stroke often does not realise anything is wrong, because the heat has begun to affect the brain itself, which is exactly why they cannot save themselves and why someone else has to notice. That is the whole reason the checking matters so much. It is not that the vulnerable person will call for help. It is that, very often, by the time they are in real danger, they no longer can, and the only thing standing between them and the worst outcome is another human being who walked over, knocked, and paid attention. None of that requires a forecast or a government program. It requires only that we decide, before the heat arrives, not to look away. That does not make the heat any less dangerous, and it does not change a single number in the forecast. The dome will form. The records will likely fall. 170 million Americans will move under dangerous heat in the weeks ahead, and the peak of the season has not even arrived. But the gap between what the machine threatens and what actually happens to people is wider than it looks, and it is filled by exactly the kind of attention and connection that no algorithm and no agency can mandate. Europe is showing us the threat in real time. The question of how we answer it is still open, which brings us, at last, all the way back to where we started, to the forecasters using words they are trained never to use, and to the thread that has run through every part of this story. We have seen the machine, we have followed it across the ocean, we have watched it kill before, on this continent, and we have learned who it takes and why. So let us finish by asking the question this whole video has been circling, the one that should stay with you long after the screen goes dark. What exactly is the American summer about to become? Part 13, The Century of Stalled Skies. Before we answer the question we have been building toward, I want to pull all the way back, past this week, past this summer, past Europe and America both, and look at the whole shape of what is happening to the sky over the Northern Hemisphere. Because the heat dome over Europe is not a single event. It is one frame from a much longer film, and once you see the film, the individual frames stop looking like accidents. Start with the most important thing to understand about the jet stream, the thing that makes this a planetary story and not a regional one. The jet stream is a single, unbroken river of air that circles the entire Northern Hemisphere. It does not begin at Europe and end at the Atlantic. It does not start over America and stop at the coast. It is one continuous loop, wrapping the globe from the Pacific across North America, over the Atlantic, across Europe and Asia, and back around again, an endless ribbon with no seams. And that single fact is why there is no such thing as a purely local heat dome anymore. When that ribbon develops its big, stalling waves, it develops them all the way around. A ridge over Europe is mechanically linked to a trough somewhere else, and a ridge somewhere else again, all of them part of the same standing wave pattern in the same continuous current. The ocean between Europe and America is not a wall, it is just the water underneath one stretch of a river that flows over both continents, This is the deepest reason Europe's disaster is a genuine preview rather than a distant tragedy. The two continents are not having coincidentally similar weather. They are riding the same wave on the same crippled jet, and that same jet is being weakened year after year by the same cause, an Arctic that is warming roughly twice as fast as the rest of the planet, draining the temperature contrast that gives the jet its strength. This is not a European problem or an American problem, it is a hemispheric one, and it is trending in a single direction. Now widen the time horizon, because the trend is the whole story. We keep talking about records, and there is a temptation to treat each one as a standalone shock, a once-in-a-lifetime event. But look at how they cluster. 23 of Europe's 30 worst heat waves since 1950 have struck since the year 2000. The British June record about to fall this week has stood since 1976, nearly half a century, and the record that replaces it may not survive a decade. The Pacific Northwest event of 2021 was calculated as something that should occur once in 10,000 years, and it happened anyway. These are not scattered, unrelated freaks. They are points on a curve, and the curve is bending steeply upward, and it is bending in the same direction everywhere at once. This is what scientists mean when they say the baseline is moving, and it is the single most important idea to carry out of this video, because it defeats the most comforting lie we tell ourselves about extreme weather. The lie is that there is a new normal, a slightly hotter but stable climate that we will adjust to and then settle into. But there is no stable plateau to settle onto, because the warming Arctic and the stalling jet and the rising background temperature are all still trending. Each decade's unimaginable extreme becomes the next decade's severe summer, and then the decade after that, it becomes an ordinary July. The record does not stand as a permanent monument. It becomes a stepping stone to the next one. The summer that horrifies us this year is, in the long arithmetic of the trend, one of the cooler summers of the rest of our lives. Step back even further, to the scale of the planet itself, and there is a sobering perspective hidden in the geology. The Earth has been far hotter than this in its deep past. The atmosphere has run at temperatures that would be lethal to most life as we know it, in epochs long before human beings existed. So the planet is not in danger in some cosmic sense. The Earth will be fine. It has been an oven before, and it will spin on regardless. What is new, what has never existed in the entire history of the planet, is 8 billion people and the fixed, immovable infrastructure of a global civilization. All of it built during a brief, unusually stable stretch of mild climate. All of it assuming that stability would hold. Our cities sit where they sit. Our farmland grows what it grows because of the climate it was planted into. Our power grids and water systems and supply chains were all engineered for the world as it was. The danger is not to the planet. The danger is to the extraordinarily specific, extraordinarily fragile arrangement of human life that was built on the assumption that the sky would keep behaving the way it always had. And the sky is no longer behaving that way. That is the real meaning of a stalled jet stream and a continent under red alert. It is not just that this week is hot. It is that the atmosphere has entered a mode our civilization was never designed for, and it is doing it faster at the top of the world, which slows the jet, which stalls the domes, which compounds the heat, in a chain that runs from the melting Arctic straight down to the overnight low on the Spanish coast that would not fall below 86 degrees. Every link in that chain is measured, none of it is hidden, and all of it is pointed the same way. So when forecasters look at Europe this week and then look west across the Atlantic, they are not seeing two separate weather stories. They are seeing one machine, one trend, one continuous river of air doing the same dangerous thing all the way around the hemisphere, with Europe simply standing at the spot where it shows first. The preview is playing. The only question left is what it is previewing for the 170 million people about to move under the same machine. So let us finally answer it. Let us talk about what the American summer is actually about to become. Part 14. What the American summer is about to become. So what is the American summer about to become? After everything we have walked through, I think the honest answer is this. The American summer is about to become a test of whether a preview is enough, because that is what Europe has handed us this week, whether we asked for it or not. A preview. The most sensitive instrument on the planet for measuring where this is all heading has just delivered its reading, in records and red alerts and a death toll that is already climbing, and the reading is unambiguous. The machine is real. It is stronger than it used to be. It stalls more than it used to. and it is not finished. Europe is showing the rest of the Northern Hemisphere the next few steps before we take them, which is the rarest gift a disaster can offer, the chance to see it coming. Here is what we know is coming, stated plainly, with no drama added and none subtracted. The same stalled jet stream cooking Europe is throwing up a heat dome over the United States. Forecasters expect it to put roughly 170 million Americans under dangerous heat in the weeks ahead. The most extreme heat is aimed at the West and the Pacific Northwest, the very region that suffered a 1 in 10,000 year disaster just a few years ago. A strengthening El Niño is loading extra heat into the entire system, stacking a second amplifier on top of the first. The population has not had time to acclimate, because it is still early in the season, which means the peak of the heat is still ahead of us, not behind. And much of America lives in the kind of humid environment where the real survival threshold, the one science recently discovered is lower than we thought, can be reached at temperatures that do not even look that extreme on a thermometer. That is not a forecast for a distant, abstract future. The first edge of it is already in today's data, in the Pacific Northwest running near record highs, in Houston's heat index climbing toward 107, in South Florida under major heat risk, in Southern California sliding into advisories. The machine is not approaching, it is here in its opening movement. But I told you this is also where the hope lives, and I meant it, because everything we learned from the disasters of the past points to the same liberating truth. The temperature is not the death toll. The same heat, in two communities, produces wildly different numbers of dead, and the difference is written not by the thermometer but by how connected and how prepared and how watchful those communities are. The machine decides how hot it gets. We decide, to a degree that genuinely matters, how many of us it takes. The lever is in human hands. It always has been. It is the knock on the door, the check-in with the elderly neighbour, the decision to take the red alert seriously instead of treating heat as mere discomfort. Europe rebuilt its entire relationship with heat after 70,000 of its people died, and the systems it built will save lives this week. The question for America is whether we absorb that lesson from watching, or whether we insist on learning it the same way Europe did, by counting the dead first. And that is the core mystery I want to leave you sitting with, because it is the question underneath this entire story, and I do not think anyone can answer it yet. Europe is the fastest warming, most heat-exposed major region on the planet, and after the catastrophe of 2003 it became one of the most prepared, with national alert systems and vulnerable person registries, and a hard-won cultural understanding of how heat kills. And even Europe, with all of that preparation, is being told by its own forecasters that the heat arriving this week could be worse than the event that killed 70,000 of its people. Now take that same machine, that same stalled jet, that same compounding dome, and move it across the Atlantic onto a continent that has not had Europe's reckoning, where in many places heat is still treated as an inconvenience, rather than the deadliest weather hazard there is, where the social fabric that saved lives in Chicago has thinned, and where 170 million people are about to find out what their cities and their communities are actually made of. So the mystery is this: if the most prepared region on Earth is bracing for something worse than its worst catastrophe, then what does the same machine do when it reaches a place that has not yet learned the lesson, and are the cities and the people of America any more ready for what is coming than Europe was, all the way back in 2003, before it knew what heat could do? Europe knew, after that summer, exactly what it was up against. The hard truth is that America is about to find out, in real time over the months ahead, and the answer is not written yet. The preview is playing right now, across an entire continent, in temperatures that are breaking records that have stood for half a century. Whether we treat it as a warning or as someone else's distant weather is the one part of this story that has not been decided by the machine. That part is still up to us. The sky has shown its hand. What we do with the time the preview has bought us is the only question left, and the summer that is about to unfold is going to answer it, one hot night at a time.